Welcome back, Scalers, to another episode of Scale Busters. In this one,
feed the hungriest horses and kind of, hey, we really make our users happy. Launching tech and building tech to building a business.
in this episode, I'm going to be chatting to Trine Falnes, who's the COO of a startup called Spond, a direct-to-consumer app for just about any organized activity. From your kids' football team to your own book club, whatever it might be, they have 750,000 weekly active users. That's insane. And Trine is an expert at defining a growth strategy. So today she's going to share with you her best tips and tools of how you can do one too. Trine, welcome to the show. Should we get right into it?
Yeah.
How do you define a growth strategy? Because I can imagine at different stages of your business, you need to grow different things, right? Team, revenue, even scaling your production, your processes. So how do you approach understanding what should grow?
Yeah, so I think, that's obviously like the multi-million-dollar question a lot of the times, like how do you grow in a smart manner? And I think also like, it's not like you grow in isolation of what's going on around you. So obviously like what we've been doing in the sense of growth this year is very, very different from what we did last year. So I think it's just, it's when I started and we were kind of designing this growth strategy, it was a little bit more of kind of, what can essentially propel us in the direction that we want to go. I think, you in the beginning as a startup, you talk about like product market fit, right? But like the really, really hard work and like what happens actually between product market fit and scale, I mean, that's the tough part of things. And that's kind of what we've been trying to find a good way to approach. So I think we spent a lot of time just thinking about like, where is it that Spawn has like an unfair advantage? We started talking about or looking at, what are markets that have certain characteristics that are attractive to us. It can be the way they're organized, the way they emphasize like sports, like children and youth. It can be obviously how advanced they are from a digital and technology point of view. So just kind of getting all of these pieces right. And then also secondly, looking at what are the characteristics of a market where it makes sense then to kind of increase activation or to do even more. So we started essentially looking at the geographies where we already had a presence just from like dropping the product. So it was almost like dropping it and then listening, like, what are they saying? And we came up with this idea of like, okay, we're going to seed the market to a certain level. So what that means in terms of the number of users, for example, is like obviously like varies greatly from one country to another or one geography to another. But it was still this idea of like starting to get your baseline covered from a user point of view. And then also like stopping and listening, like where do you start seeing organic traction coming off of that initial feed that propels you to the next level. So that was what we did essentially then was we came up with a basic kind of a toolkit that we could approach any given market. So knowing that if we identified the markets where there were characteristics that were, to our advantage, how can we essentially deploy different activation strategies or tactics to accelerate that growth?
Trine, when you say toolkit, what do you actually mean? Do you mean a step-by-step guide that anyone could follow? Step one, do this, step two, do that? What do you actually mean by toolkit?
Yeah, I think, it's not so much like as an actual toolkit with like a playbook that's like step one, it's not like that so much as it is different types of activation that you could look at. It's essentially like, what are the different ways that we can get in touch with our users? So what comes in there is essentially like you have like all the traditional stuff, right? You have like how can you create growth loops with a new product, which is something that we're going to be spending more time on this year. It's like getting your performance marketing right, identifying all the like infrastructural pieces, like knowing what is a reasonable spend for a user in a given market. And then it's essentially, what is the role of partnerships? What is the role of like communication? What is the role of research? One thing we did in the UK is that we commissioned a research piece that was quite interesting. So we surveyed all of our users, and then we also, we surveyed a lot of people in our segment just to kind of really understand their pain points.
Yeah, Trine, that's a really interesting thought, actually, to use an external partner, a research agency to do the work for you. Because, we've all heard the age-old user testing and then listening to the feedback and iterating on your product, building a new product based on the feedback from your customers. But let's be honest, how many of us really fill out questionnaires, and are they really actually good at getting customer feedback? but maybe using a third party because it's not a commercial interest. It's maybe a third party who's just simply trying to figure out the facts and figures. They are somewhat disguising your interest. Does it mean that people are more likely to respond? I'd be curious to know. What are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even say it as to like disguise it. It was just like our approach in the market because, like this was kind of before we really scaled things in that market or like entered it like for real. So it wouldn't have made sense with like the user base that we had there to just kind of carry it. I mean, it wouldn't fit the purpose of it. The purpose was to talk to users that were in our segment that we hadn't yet activated and say, look, tell us about what's going on in your life. So like for sure, like there were no other options to actually commission that. In the UK, we use Census-wide, for example. Like there's plenty of agencies that will carry that out for you. And
Census-wide, I'll put a link to them in the comments below, and I'll actually put a link to some other examples of independent agencies that you could use to do research for you.
Having that kind of distance and having someone else carry it through too, like when we went to like partners with it, or when we went to the media, or when we were partaking in conferences, that kind of stuff, like it gave us a different entry point. And what was also interesting then, Matt, was that we could then, these were question sets that we are already kind of putting against our own user base too, to a certain extent, not all the questions, but most of them. So what actually came out as like a side narrative that was really interesting was to see the delta.
Delta means difference, by the way.
To see that, for example, when we looked at users that were not yet using a purpose-built tool like Spond to manage their activity, they were significantly more miserable, right? So it was like, that was super exciting for us because we're like, hey, we really make our users happy. So it was almost like a glass half empty, half full situation where like our users typically, like, speaking high level, had a lot more, drinks in their glasses than the ones that were just kind of still to discover us.
Validation is something we get told time and time and time again in the startup industry, right? It's all about building, measuring, and learning from your customers and implementing that into your product, right? How do you validate with customers at Spond? I mean, you have such a large customer base. Do you take a subset of that and send them some new features and see how it is? How do you guys do it?
We've done everything from like, we obviously run our like recurring surveys where we talk to our users. We also do quite a bit of like user interviews. It was one of the things that I actually spent a lot of time doing once I started in designing the growth strategy as well. Like I was literally like said, I'm going to do this, so many interviews with our users every single week in different segments that I thought was attractive, and just to kind of understand what they were dealing with. So I think when it comes to validating, I think it's a little bit of like taking your mental framework, or like, this is where we're at, these are our baseline hypothesis, and then carry those out in conversations and say like, to what extent does that match up with where our users are at? So typically, like, for example, when we build features now, we've done like one big feature, or one big kind of almost like a product that we have coming up, like is very indicative of how we work with user testing. So like before, like our initial baseline was to like do tons of user testing or user interview, user kind of feedback surveys, that kind of stuff. And then that led into us putting out a prototype as kind of an initial, this is our best bet at the moment. And then doing more testing on that prototype, doing the evaluation on that, iterating on it, and then carrying kind of our iterated best effort into production. So I think that's we have a really strong team, and, kind of that, always carrying out that approach in like the smaller stuff and the bigger stuff. Sometimes, of course, it's challenging because going through that, you end up, you might have a hypothesis like, okay, it's going to take us 3 months to get this to market, and then it ends up being 4 months or something like that, or 5. But at the same time, like what you go to market with is always so much better. So I wouldn't have wanted it any other way.
All right, Trina, on the show, we always like to ask our guests some lessons that they've learned, things they wish they'd known when they started, or maybe just lessons from your journey, whether it's, for example, customer feedback. Never ask that on a Friday after 1. I don't know.
So I think a lot of the things that has been a benefit for me dealing with like, or coming from bigger organizations, that tend to have like their bread and butter deliveries ingrained already, or someone has already executed on that, was that startups are super lean and they're fast moving. And, when you get into the scale up side of things, you would kind of assume coming from the outside that you have like your bread and butter infrastructure already in there, so like you would know your KPIs, you would have like a clear understanding of your value proposition, your goal, and you would have, you would have all the processes kind of designed a little bit more. But in my opinion, when I came into Spawn, like that was one of the things where I'm like, okay, we really like just taking the time to reflect upon like things that we talk about now, like what goals would really make a difference. What are the data points that could help us pinpoint us in the direction of where it makes most sense for us to kind of increase our efforts or decrease our efforts. So that was one thing that I had some like learnings, coming from the background that I did, and I think really benefited the company, because you never have time really in a startup or a scale up to step back and be like, okay, we're going to now figure out like our data warehouse, KPI, infrastructure. It's a huge delivery and everyone's just kind of hustling and getting to the next iteration or the next product. So I think I brought some sense of like, okay, we need to slow down in some areas to build kind of the baseline, because it would make it easier for us to get to that next level. And once we launch products, we can better evaluate them also from like some data points that are important to us.
Is there anything else you want to share?
I think you never really get it right? There's no moment where you just sit back and be like, oh, this was amazing. Like we figured it out. Like we haven't figured it out, but we are learning a lot as we go along. And like the things that we're starting to be like, okay, this feels good, or this feels right, or it feels like we've created a new, like kind of come to a new level. Like that's really encouraging. And I think, you're never really better than what you did yesterday. So there's always that idea of like continuing and evolving from that. But I think the startup and scale up world is really cool when it comes to just like acknowledging like, okay, we did this, it was good. We did this, it sucked, and it's like, there has to be an honesty to which like you kind of face yourself every day. And I don't think for us that we've gotten it right in the terms of that we've actually executed on it, but I do think we kind of know what to execute on now. And I think that's a really cool thing, that we've arrived at a point where we know what we need to do. We know what's going to serve us in the next phase of our business. We've not gotten it right yet, but we have a feel of like that direction and what that means for our business. And I think that's really meaningful and fun. That's the fun part.
Obvious question, Trina, everyone wants to know is, where is Spond today? I know obviously your growth trajectory might have been impacted by COVID. What are you guys doing? How are you dealing with it?
No, we have absolutely not torn anything apart. But what we have done is just to kind of reflect upon, in the light of what's going on around us, like what is the best thing that we can do? What is right for our company? And I think what we decided to do then was just to we became a lot more introvert, of course, because we turned off a lot of our activity sets. Activity essentially closed down in most markets during kind of like the toughest periods of it. And we were really introverts. So we focused a lot on like building our product, getting our infrastructure right. Like I talked about the KPIs, the reporting, the insight pieces, and having this kind of really focus that was partially forced, but that were also things that we wanted to do anyhow, it became quite beneficial to us. And I think overall, what we've been working on for a while is this methodology of like having a sequential focus where you'd focus on one thing and then the next thing. Like we're still a really small team, a super strong, talented team. I'm so happy to work with the people that I do, but yet, there's benefits to just saying, okay, now we're just going to focus on this delivery. And so I think that's kind of been our response to it a little bit. And then also staying in touch with our users, making them aware how they can use Spond as like a means of communication, keeping conversations alive, even if you can't do them in person. So for our growth strategy, we are actually like at an all-time high now with our traffic. From a user point of view, we've actually seen less of a negative impact. So, I think it's all about just kind of figuring out in like these moments of national crisis to just like, what does it mean for us, and how can we set ourselves up in a way that, doesn't impact ourselves negatively? Like, where's the silver lining to this? And the silver lining for us was definitely a very intense, introverted focus on product and getting things right.
All right, Trina, I know it's an obvious one, but I know that many people watching this will be really curious to see what your answer is. But if you were starting out today, in today's world, in today's climate, how would you approach, or how would that change your approach to defining a growth strategy?
Well, I think starting a little bit where we were, where, it's like, you want to kind of figure out, what are our options? Like, what does our option map look like? I think that's always a good idea. Like, where do you have as a company, or from a value proposition point of view, or like where you see traction, like where do you have an unfair advantage? What are, for example, the goals that would really make a difference? I think kind of you can always set like, lists and lists of goals, because there's always so much to do, and especially in smaller organizations, but to really focus on the ones that would shift, that would put you on a different trajectory. Absolutely. And I think also where, we spent a little bit of time of figuring out, like I wouldn't say like what's the path of least resistance, because we're like hardworking busy bees, but it was a little bit when we were starting to just kind of put something out there in the market, like I talked about seeding it, to just see, how is that being received, and then essentially like feed the hungriest horses, and kind of, not that we're letting the other ones die, but just to kind of really focus on just like following that momentum. And I think that brings me to another point where we started figuring out for ourselves a little bit more too, like what are the momentum metrics? So when we're looking at growth, and I think it's hard to say like on a high level, in a high level manner, like what that means for different companies, like what are those metrics? But it's the ones that really shift, the ones that are really, really important. So also spending some time, really checking in with your company and saying like, what part of the business are we really good at the moment? And what are the areas that we aren't so good at? And then what is critical for us to nail in terms of getting to the next level? So I think that that's the challenge always at this startup scale up level, that, you have so much to do. Like there's a laundry list at any given moment of things that, demand your attention, and then just really being kind of focused and boiling it down to like, okay, what are the things that really would make an impact? So I think just really a lot more for us to like focus on impact, focus on like, what are the momentum metrics? What are the things we really need to get right? I think boiling it down to that, and always kind of checking in with yourself when things start getting complicated or complex, to just be like, okay, let's go back to the basics. Why are we here? Like, what are we trying to create? And when also like, when life happens, Matt, and like there's a pandemic or something else, I mean, there could be opportunities coming out of that too. You could always say, is this an opportunity to launch a new value proposition? Should we shift into another segment? And I think that's something that we've been hearing a lot now, that from our users, that while they're really happy about the space that we're in and how we're solving the problems that we are solving for them, they have like, there's new problems that have come up. So now we're starting to kind of dig into those conversations and figure out, okay, what does this mean for us? Is there a new value proposition that we could launch in response to these newly articulated problems that have come up?
Lots of golden takeaways there for us. Thanks, Trina. Now, one question I get all the time is, what tools and services, softwares can you use to improve your functioning, your growth scaling? Is there anything that you use on a regular basis?
I think when we started working with OKR, it was too like fragmented. So I think the pandemic kind of taught us to be even more focused. So now it's almost more of like a sequential focus, where like we do this and then we do that. And also understanding that different projects are in different levels of maturity. So we have some that are like at the research level, and that initial like research lag is tremendously intense, right? You can spend so much time on research before you even get to like, this is what we're going to build. So that typically has very different lead times than when you're actually building something that you have scoped, or like putting something that you're optimizing, for example. So I think, I'm not sure if we'll go back to like the full on OKR, or if we'll just work more like sequential and focused. So we're testing some different kind of approaches to that now, and I feel like it's almost like we're developing like our own method.
So Trina, it sounds like your growth strategy has really been built around product verification and validation from customers, right? In the methods that you've told us. But when you get to a level of scale where you have a large customer base like you do, 800,000 users, and you have many features and many improvements you've rolled out, at what point do you stop doing that? At what point do you stop going through such deep product development, verification, and validation? Because I can imagine that the utility, like the benefit for the customer, is decreasing after you hit a certain inflection point where, for example, at the beginning of your business, when you had only 3 features and you added a 4th, that was a huge impact for the customers. It helped to keep the current ones and add new ones, right? But when you've got 800,000 customers and you've got over 100 features on the platform, and you listen to a feedback from a few small customers and you add one new feature, the impact to the existing customers is so much less because it's the 101st feature, right? So my question is, when do you reach that inflection point? And what do you do when you do that? Have you reached the inflection point yet?
I guess like yes and no from different perspectives. Sorry. So like the no is definitely like no, because there's such value to continuing to listening to your users. Like in the midst of the pandemic, for example, like people are not so worried about, I mean, organization, communication, that kind of stuff is still really important. But like the big animal that's now come up is more across, how do we get people back to activity, like in this new world of what that means. And then also like funding and financing, like that element. So it's like, there's almost like new things pop up that you need to cater to. I would never say, I see others do that where they go very much into like the skills and drills element of things. And that's where I think you're right. Like there's no point in just kind of surveying like less than 1% of your community, or you know what I mean? Like I'm not saying that that's 1%, but like you need to kind of be mindful of like where you employ your efforts. But I think the other thing of like where it gets bigger is that I think making sure when you grow that you kind of shift that mindset from like launching tech and building tech to building a business. I think that's a little bit more of like where we've been spending and will be spending even more time in the future. Because it comes with a maturity, right? It's like in the beginning, you're very kind of tech and product focused. And then it becomes more like, okay, how does this fit with a business? How does it fit with, how do we activate certain level of our business against our audience, and of course, how do we continue to grow in new markets?
Trine, thank you so much for joining us on Scalebusters. Now, I want to sum up a few things that Trine said. Number one, identifying your unfair advantage is a great way to know where to spend time and energy when defining a growth strategy. Number two, momentum metrics and feeding the hungry horses. Know where you put capital in, you get outcome. Number three, constantly verifying and validating your product with your customers. Getting into that cycle, always improving, always listening, and thinking about actually using some external research parties to help you understand your customer in new markets or even in your existing one. And a key one about the scaling journey and a lesson from Trine was when you launch, build, and grow tech, know when to start launching and building a business. You need to have that inflection point where you move away from just building and product iterating and developing to actually building a business, finding out where you can make money in the product once you've improved and ironed things out. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Scalebusters. We'll be back with another episode. Here's a sneak peek.
When consumers make purchase decisions, we're always super scared of making a mistake. Raise money before you need them. We started raising capital, or really started working on it when we were in dire needs. And when the launch goes good, you get an upward spiral. And after that, you enter the first 3 days are good. The first 3 days are like a lot of traction, boom, maybe some press articles, and you're talking.